Record on this computer.
All right. Hello and welcome to episode 2. Today we're going to discuss the facts of the case, the investigation, as well as cover the sequence and timeline of events as they unfolded. The facts of this case found the name of the missing woman, not the other way around. Let's start at the beginning. What were some of your first memories? How did the breadcrumbs of clues throughout your life lead to you opening a full-blown murder case?
Okay. My life has absolutely been a series of clues. People talk to me about that a lot. It's not like one day I just woke up and saw a room where a murder was happening. That's not how it happens. All of my life, I remembered that something bad happened in a motel room. I had a reoccurring nightmare for my entire childhood, probably into my teens. And the the dream always looked like I was sitting in a corner looking up into my bedroom, but my bedroom where there was this white wall became an office. And this woman was being shoved over a desk that looked much like this. And it was always kind of dark and black and white. She was being shoved over the desk. And right before she was going to be raped, my dream ended. That dream never changed. It stayed the same all of my childhood. There were other weird things I would do. My brother said I walked outside. Like I was just definitely a disturbed child all the time. I'd wake up with really severe leg pains. This one day I came home and I was the first one home. Everybody else was in high school and I was in the junior high, I think, probably 5th or 6th grade. And I came home this day and on the wall where I saw the reoccurring dream happening for, now probably 10 or so years, I don't know. I went and got a chair and I wrote on that wall, death. I took a pencil and I wrote it. It must have been 2.5 or 3 feet tall. And I wrote it across the entire length of the wall where that reoccurring dream occurred in my dreams. And I went to the kitchen and I got a knife that had a wooden handle and got a mallet and drove that knife into the wall. And so when my parents came home, there is this huge death on the wall with this knife in there. And when my dad asked me what happened, I said that when I came home, it was that way. So my father ended up calling the police and the police came and that was it. They kind of took a report. I ran over and grabbed the pencil thinking I might get in trouble. And that was the end of it. They left and I was just kind of a crazy little girl or something like that.
Right. But you've talked to therapists who have since been able to, attest to the significance and the validity of these kinds of events in early childhood.
Right. Exactly. And that's what I mean, where it's not just like you wake up one day
right
and you get a vision of a murder and then you follow it. That's not how it happens. Your whole life is the mystery. And then all of a sudden your mind opens up the door to the event.
Exactly. So when did the first full-blown memory of the murder return to you in its entirety?
My memory returned on April 2005, and I actually remember that because I moved into a house on S Street, and I have records. I kept records of everything during this time, just because not only was I trying to prove this murder to other people, I was also trying to prove the murder in my memory to myself, because you're always trying to validate yourself, because that's just how it goes. So it returned to me fully on April 2005.
Right. And I think that's an important point. You spent a lot of time trying to find anything that could, prove yourself wrong. And
Absolutely.
You looked at this case with a harder eye than anybody could have.
Absolutely.
Because ultimately you didn't want it to be true or have to be true or have to live through those things again.
Correct. Very correct. I did not want that to be true. I actually hoped often that my memory was wrong.
So tell us what you do next.
Well, I want to take a minute to just talk about recovering traumatic memories. I think a lot of people don't understand that. And so
Absolutely.
I haven't really read a whole lot of books in life that were fun, But when I went to counselors, there's this one called Trauma and Recovery, and it's an incredibly intense book, but it teaches a lot. And one of the things it says is that traumatic moments become encoded in an abnormal form of memory, which breaks spontaneously into conscious, both during flashbacks when you're awake and also in nightmares. And this happened to me so much. This book helped me so much. As soon as the memory came back, then I would have nightmares and it would come to me. Let me move this just a minute here. One of the things that I think is important as we move through this is that my memory was more accurate. And as she says, they often return with the vividness and the emotional force of the original event. And as I go through these next slides, I think it's important for us to remember that the adults at the time didn't have the accuracy that my memory did, even though I was young. I was just a few months shy of 4, but my memories came back with more accuracy that I can prove through some stuff we're going to look at next.
Is that because they're almost encapsulated and they take the shape of pristine condition because of that?
That's exactly right. They come back as snapshots. They're not a video that plays out it took me years to see all these snapshots because they'd come back in a nightmare. Like, bringing this up, last night I had another nightmare where I remember calling my dad's name because they went in the bathroom and shut the door, and that frightened me. And it's not something I would have done, call out, but many of these pieces come back to you right when you're not looking for them. So they're just snapshots and they're very vivid and when
right.
they turn. So with my memory, I began hunting for the truth. And these were the things that I did have with the original memory that came back. I didn't have a date, but I could assume that it was 1967 or 1968 because I couldn't have been any younger than that.
So you were basing the date on your age at the time?
Exactly. Originally.
Okay.
I knew that the murderers were my father, James Steele, and his friend, who we called Craig, but his name is Donald Craig Holbrook.
And at the time of the murder, you were very well familiar with this man.
Right, very well. He was at our house all the time. He was my father's right-hand kick, which in the next episode, we kind of go into Craig and my father's relationship. That's counselors have words for their relationship, and we'll talk about that later because definitely had that kind of sinister way about them. I know that the murder happened at the Riverside Hotel on State Route 14. I know where we buried the body. I know that the victim was a small blonde woman who didn't have a car. I actually remembered that we didn't get rid of a car that day, and the records, I'll show you some records that show that she didn't have a license. The other thing I remember was that we started the day in a 4-door blue car with black interior. And we come home very late at night because they wake me up after I watch them working in the dark in a 2-door gold car with black interior.
So tell us what happens next. When do you contact law enforcement and how does that sort of transpire?
Okay, so right away, I move into action with law enforcement. When you have something like this in life, people who have gone back and really kind of had a full memory be revealed, it's the missing link that you've been looking for your whole life. So when that came back to me and I saw that room, it was a very significant moment. I called my counselor at the time and said, I think you need to send men in white jackets over here because I'm losing my fucking mind. And she said, Jodie, I want you to go to a quiet place and I want you to just look at an object in the room. I don't want you to make any judgments about the object. I just want you to start telling me about the object. So I remember saying it's a fan. There's no screws that I can see. And almost immediately, I bet I got 3 facts out and I could see that room. And I said, they murdered her. That's what happened in that room. So I trusted that memory very much when it came back to me. So I phoned the Clark County Sheriff's Office. Actually, as soon as I got off the phone with my counselor, I called them because I'd been working back to this memory my entire life. And so I was 30, I don't know what I would have been in 2005. I think I was 38, something like that. So anyway, I've been looking for this memory. I didn't know that's what it was. So I phoned the Clark County Sheriff's Office right away. I also write to the Washington State Patrol on May 16th, 2005, and ask if there's any record of a crime being committed at the Riverside Motel. I received their reply on May 17th, 2005. They tell me that they don't have any records, but that the motel was actually in Vancouver city limits, so that I need to contact the Vancouver Police Department so I can move forward. So I send a detailed statement of the murder to the Vancouver Police Department. After some time, we're going to go over the facts that I recover. I get the hospital records, and then I send another statement to them September 28th, 2006. This one's a 6-page letter with much more detail around the events. And then I also write the Cold Case Cowboys on December 30th, 2006, because I can't find this woman because I don't have a date, and I need help trying to figure out how you find missing people.
Okay, so this really invigorated the beginning of your search for the facts, and
Exactly.
it initiated some conversations that you had with family members about certain events around the time of the murder, as well as anything that might help you uncover more facts.
Exactly. As memories came out, I did my own things in the couple of years that were ahead of me after I got my first recollection. At that time, as counselors will know, your memories come back to you faster. When I'd have a memory, for example, I remember blowing out the back of the car with my father and the spigot that came out of my grandmother's house. I'd drive to her house and make sure that that spigot was in exactly the location, because if I was wrong, I was going to stop the pursuit. But I wasn't wrong. Every time that I tried to prove myself wrong, I proved myself right. So I went to family members and I chatted with them ultimately. It took me some time. I went to law enforcement first, obviously. But when I needed to try to gather clues, I reached out to my mother. And my mother sends me an email on May 18th, 2005, and says, hey, I was talking to your sister, and we remember that your dad's mom worked at the Riverside Inn Motel cleaning rooms in 67 or 68, which would have made sense that he would have had the keys to that motel and full reign of that motel on probably that weekend that she was gone. My grandmother also drove a light blue Oldsmobile that had 4 doors and black interior. So again, this was very fascinating to me. Then my mother says to me that she remembers a time when we lived in the other house where Dad, Craig, and I were up cutting wood at the property. And she even tells me that we're up there all day long. And she says, if you can find the date of that day, she said, your father ended up going to the hospital that day. He was very sick because you guys were up there really late. Then you'll have the date of your murder. I also write to my father on 12/28/2005 asking for his help, and I have all of these records. I also write to Craig on June 14th, 2005, and I ask for his help as well.
Okay. And in your conversations with your mother in particular, was she forthcoming with information? Do you feel like you were able to glean any additional facts or details that helped you sort of peel back another layer of the case?
I did. I felt like in the beginning, I didn't realize that my mom could lie in a way that would lead me astray, because I wanted to just trust that she was going to help me, because we all want to have that belief. But in the beginning, I remember her even saying, you guys were up there so late that your father was up in the hospital. But I find out later that my mom lies at that time. Maybe she forgot she lied. I doubt that she forgets she lies, but who knows? So anyway, I felt like she was trying to help me, but in the end, I felt like she would only give me enough, maybe to keep me close to her. I don't know.
Okay. Okay.
So
what happens next? What did you do?
I go ahead and I get a hold of the Washington State. Well, first, what I do is I put in 1967, 1968. I was very novice at the time around finding missing people. And so I limited it to Washington State, which ultimately ended up being a mistake, but I didn't know that at the time. So not having a date, I searched in 67, 68. There were 2 women who are missing from that time period. There's a Verla and a Karen. However, I write to the state patrol and I ask for these records. They withhold what they need to withhold. They send me those records on June 10th, 2005, and the descriptions just don't fit. I remember this lady because she's very kind and she lets me look in her purse, and I remember she's blonde. And these women, although they're small, they weren't blonde. Both of them were dark haired. So I felt like I was at an impasse. And I even write to my father and I tell him I find these 2 people, and he knows I'm fishing because he knows that this isn't them. And I also tell him I'm going to look in Oregon because I hadn't done that yet. 15 years ago, maybe the same tools were there. I just was kind of a novice around how you hunt for people. And it was actually the Cold Case Cowboys, believe it or not, that gave me the information that said you have to kind of cast a net broader, but we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Okay. So you felt you were at a slight impasse in this way. So what did
Because
you?
it was right, there were no people who fit. There just were no people.
Right, and you were not going to make something fit that didn't fit. So you moved
Right.
on to look at other pieces of the case. And what were some of
That's exactly right. So here's the murder scene. This was the hotel that my grandmother worked at in 67, 68. It's called the Riverside Inn. Well, it's called the Riverside Motel. It's off of Highway 14. It's very interesting to note that Highway 14 is right off of I-5, and it only goes from Vancouver to Goldendale. It's been there since the 50s. The top right picture is the room that we were in, and that bathroom door is the bathroom that they cleaned that woman up in after they murdered her. So anyway, it's just interesting to look at these things. I actually just found this picture last night, as it would be on Facebook, because people have this living in Vancouver, and it actually gave me nightmares because that room, I drew a picture of that room and mailed it to myself when this first happened. Just again, if I could go down there one day to prove my memory right or wrong. And that sketch is take away the rocking chair. There was only one bed. The bed was polyester in the 60s, not cotton as these are shown. The TV was on the other wall, not that wall. Otherwise, the room schematic is exactly the same.
Okay, wow. So this is the scene as it was, more or less. Can you tell us anything else about the weather or the layout of the parking lot as you?
Yeah, and actually I can tell you in that upper left hand picture, the way that car is pulled in is very significant. And I actually write that in the graph that I drew, because it would seem logical to have the cars going the other way, but the car goes the opposite way of the building. And I remember that as a child, because right where that yellow car is, I was sitting in that white chair right in front of that car. And Dad walked me quite a ways down that.
And is that where the office is located?
The office is that yellow building. Exactly. There's 2 buildings. This bottom picture is the other building, but and the office is right in the middle of the 2.
Okay.
Yes, and you're right. I do look at the weather. I remember when I was in that white chair, I had a dress on because I remember my bare legs and the sun being out, and I don't remember being cold. And so again, I went down to the local library and I went through microfiche and found this is the Columbian, the local newspaper, Friday, June 7th, 1968, and it forecasts the weather. I have more that I didn't put in here, but there was no precipitation. Anybody can Google it, actually. The weather was exactly as I remember it. The day was sunny.
Okay. Oh, and this is more about the weather here.
This is the other important thing was I remember that we were working at the property with headlights on. It's late at night. It's not twilight, it's late at night. And this is the closest thing that I could find, but you see that the sun sets in the Northwest in all of these time periods are 9 o'clock at night. And this becomes significant in a little bit, but we'll talk about that in a minute.
Right. So did you reach out and talk with any other family members about what they remember from that day and how it might line up with this sort of unfolding of events in relation to time and time of day?
I did. write to my uncle and I ask him, he's my dad's brother and they were close. They lived close. So I write to him and I don't have the letter I sent to him, but I have the letter where he responds to me. And I say that I remember a murder in a motel room. It's this day. Can he tell me any events around that? And these are excerpts from that letter. It was a 3-page letter and there's just some excerpts here. But I think what's interesting is that everybody remembers this day. It was obviously a very significant day because when I write to people, all of this, I mean, even my mom's like, oh, I remember that day, but your dad was cutting wood. Like everybody remembers this day.
And by everyone, you mean all of your extended family or anyone?
Right. I guess everybody is Craig, obviously, because I talked to him later and we'll do another episode where I go talk to him, but everybody remembers this day. Who was around during that time, which my father was a very private person and we'd have parties, but they didn't hang out in our house. So
Right.
Harold, my mother, Craig, right. They don't forget this day. So here is part of the letter from my uncle. And he says, hi, Jodie, I have no problems answering your questions. As with any event that occurred 40 years ago, my recollection and those of others may differ. You said you only recall bits and pieces, and that is true for me also. Regarding the day you asked about, the bathtub, etc., my memory is not the same as Lori's. I am not saying that she's wrong. I'm just saying that my memory may be different. My memory of that day is that Stan and Lori, that was my parents, had a spat of some kind, and that Lori left and went to her mother's. Maybe that's why Stan was taking care of you and the other kids. I don't know. The other kids were not with me. The bathtub becomes important in a minute with the hospital records. But this also supports my memory in that I was with my father that day. And why does he remember this? Because if he just comes over to throw my dad in a bathtub and bring him to the hospital, why does he remember that my parents have a spat and that I'm with them? It just seems, the whole thing seems very odd, but we'll go ahead and continue here. He says, I do not recall being at the home waiting for Stan to return, as Lori has said. It is not something that I would have done as I lived a few blocks away. I also do not think it was late at night as indicated. I got a phone call, I think from my father or mother, and was asked to go assist. I do not recall for sure who called me. When I got there, Stan was on the couch and passed out. Your grandfather Steele was there. Now, again, if he just gets called in at this moment, I don't know why he knows about my parents' fight. The whole day is very interesting. So this supports my memory as well, that my mother was home alone. When we came home late at night, the door was open and she was standing in an open door waiting for us. When we got there, it was just me, her, and Craig and the kids. The kids were in bed. It was just the 3 of us, the 4 of us, it was always the 3 of us and mom. So he remembers it not being late at night, which is interesting when we get into the hospital records. Then he says, if I do not recall if I got there first or if my father got there first, we tried a number of things to wake Stan up, but nothing worked. I suggested the bathtub and cold water. This did not work either. I still remember my father saying, this boy is going to the hospital. My father and I loaded him up into the car and we took him to the emergency room. So this also supports my memory, and we'll see in the hospital records that they bring him to the emergency room and they're admitted at ER at 12:55 a.m. And then he says, I do not recall Craig being there or your mother. But I can tell you without a doubt that Dad was and made the appropriate decision to take him to the hospital. Then he apologizes if somebody remembers it differently. The hospital records are going to show that the wife was there at the time. And the reason I say all this is that it is convoluted, but people are seemingly very vague about their recollection about this day. And then he says, Linda, that's his wife, recalls the incident, and we both think the date would have been about 1966, as Tracy was a baby. But then he says, it was about 2 years before I started with the fire department, which is very significant because he was the fire chief of that department for many years later in his life. The first part of 1968. And there's a huge discrepancy there because it seems like he and his wife are talking and it's 66, but now all of a sudden when he remembers an important thing in his life, which the fire department was, he remembers that it was 1968.
Right.
He asked me 2 questions. He says, I don't recall the gold car with black interior. because I told him the details. And then he said, did your parents own their property during that time frame? So I have that brings up two questions. Was there a gold car, and did my parents own the property at that time?
So ultimately, this correspondence answered some questions, but it also brought some questions to your attention. So how did you go about solving those two questions?
I didn't have this picture, but I went to, after this happened, I didn't go to my parents' house for very much at all in my adult life. Obviously, we were very estranged, but from time to time I would go up and see them. After my father died, I went up and dug through some pictures and sat with my mom for an afternoon. And I found this picture of me. That's me in the picture. This is about 10 or 11 months before the murder. And there is the gold car in the background with a black interior. That's a Ford Galaxy. And so we have proof that we had that gold car. In fact, I there the other day just to make sure that was the house across the street from us. And it is indeed the house on Delaware Lane. So my father was very much into cars, and he clearly had that. Maybe it wasn't his favorite car, and maybe that's why we took it, but we certainly had it because there it is. Then my uncle asked me if they had their property at the time, because we lived in Vancouver on Delaware Lane. We moved into that house when I turned 4. This shows that they contracted to buy that 40 acres on July 17th, 1967. So we indeed had that property. This shows that the effective year that the house was built is 1968. So we buried the body in June and we moved into the house in December in 1968. So that's proof that we did have that property during that time. So
not only is it proof, it fits into the timeline perfectly.
It's exactly perfect. That's exactly. Because if we didn't have the property, then again, everything I was saying would have been poppycock, but
right. So next, let's discuss a little bit about how you acquired those hospital records that we've talked a little bit about.
Okay. Oh, and this
right.
Actually, my father wore a knife always on his belt in those days. He had a leather case that it fit down into, and so I asked my uncle about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I also asked about Alcoa because Craig worked at Alcoa, and I remember that day that Craig had on blue coveralls. So I don't know if Dad was with her the night before, and this is why they got in a fight, because Grandma obviously was away for the weekend and Craig was there. So he's answering the blue coverall question, but then he says, I call the incident with the knife. And he says the sheriff's department was called to the scene. 2 guys were drinking too much. The reason I asked this was because it was just who my father was. He was an absolute hillbilly with the Confederate flag tattooed on his arm with a rebel underneath it. That was just who he was. And so my uncle confirms that.
Right, that he carried a knife, that there's history of violence there. Okay, so let's get into discussing the hospital records. How you found them. I think it's a really fascinating story, and ultimately what they revealed.
Okay. This was the actual, when my mother said to me, if I get the hospital records, I will have the date of the murder, then that became very important to me because I wanted to make this right for all of us. And so this is the actual request that I brought to my father. I didn't bring it to my father. I actually gave it to my mom and asked my mom to get that signed. And it took several months for him to sign it. I don't know how she got it signed, but ultimately, and later I even thought I should have forged it. Nobody would have ever known, but I didn't forge it. My father actually did sign it and return it to me for whatever reason. Thank God that he did. And these are the actual hospital. That's the microfiche. And you can see the envelope that it came in, that Southwest Washington Medical Center. This was after months of waiting for my father to sign that release. It was quite significant. When I walked into the Southwest Washington Medical Center, this woman disappears for a minute. She comes back and she hands me this white envelope, but she doesn't hand it to me. She holds on to it and says to me, I don't know what you're looking for with these, but these were in a box to be destroyed next week. And she handed it to me and said, I hope you find what you're looking for.
Wow.
And I did. So that it is weird how these kinds of things go, but I believe it was significant to get this. Without these hospital records, I would have never found the date of the murder. And they were going to be destroyed the next week, but I got them.
Incredible.
It is incredible, actually.
And that was almost a year-long process of
It was. It
those
was.
hospital records.
Exactly.
Did you make any headway in the meantime while you were waiting for?
No, honestly, I didn't. I think during that time, I probably got a hold of the cold case cowboys. There wasn't really anything I could do until I got that date. Everything was pretty much stagnated.
Right.
Kind of takes off after I get this date that are in these hospital records. So we can go through these hospital records and see some of the significance.
Yeah.
So this is the actual microfiche. I had to actually take it down to the local library because that's the only way you can read microfiche. It's very odd. I still have those, but
Wow.
you really read them. He was admitted Sunday, June 9th, 1968 at 12:55 a.m. So the second that I saw that, I felt such a relief in my soul because I knew it was late at night. I'd watched them working in the dark, in the distance, burying that woman. I remember them waking me up when they got in the car. I remember it being late when my mother was standing in the door. And when I saw these, I was right and they were wrong.
So it immediately validated your version of events, your time.
Exactly. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. And so that puts the murder on Saturday, June 8th, 1968. We can conclude that from the date, obviously, on the hospital records because it's 12:55 a.m., which is early morning. So the day before would have been Saturday, June 8th, 1968. It's very significant. That changes the entire trajectory of where we go next then.
You have the date.
We have the date. That's exactly right. And it's huge. So talking to the cold case cowboys, we'll talk about that in a minute. Here is another record where it says wife states patient is a diabetic, went to sleep about 7 p.m. on the couch and was unable to be aroused since, even after a cold bath. And it says he's foaming at the mouth and appears somewhat rigid. And so the significance of that is huge. My father was a diabetic since he was 14 years old. He had juvenile onset diabetes. Every single member of my family, because everything was about my father, we all knew how to take care of my dad. There is no way on God's green fucking earth that my mother let him lay on that couch for 6 hours. He didn't go to sleep at 7. He was up working. We walked in the door. He was unconscious. Craig had carried him in. But she lies on these hospital records, which is also very significant because she knows she's got to hide. And what is
right? This isn't a simple misremembering.
It's not a simple misremembering.
The night of when she's asked. And do you think that she has, possible ulterior motives for perhaps providing an alibi for him? Of course you're just speculating, but what do you think?
Well, it is speculation, but it's also a bit circumstantial in the sense that she says to me, you guys are up cutting wood. If we were up cutting wood and she believed that, why would she lie about this? Because there's no way that we were cutting wood and that he comes in and goes to sleep. My father was only 29 years old. He was a very thin man. We all knew how to take care of him. She had 4 children. My father was the idol of her life. There's just no way he's going to lay there for 6 hours because a diabetic, if you've ever been around a diabetics, there's all of these things that happen before foaming at the mouth is you're dead. You're almost dead. If you're foaming at the mouth and you're rigid the way he was, you're not going to there would have been so many symptoms leading up to that before that she would.
And they both knew how to care for and prevent this kind of thing from happening.
Absolutely. We all knew, even as children, we knew because my father was a heavy drinker and he didn't eat a lot. And so we all knew how to take care of him. Well, I certainly did. I don't know if the other kids did.
And even though he was a heavy drinker and you still never saw anything remotely close
Never,
to
not in
him
those
go
days.
into this state.
No, as he got older, he would go in reactions a little bit more often, but I was little and he was drunk all the time. So I don't know. I mean, that's like when he got in the back of the car, I couldn't tell if he was drunk or if he was in a reaction because he was just being so silly.
Right. And to be clear, remind our viewers what you're referring to, the night of the murder, a memory you have of after the burial of the woman.
Right. Dad, well, I'm asleep and I remember the car door being open and I can see the lights behind the car door and I don't know who's climbing in because it's so late at night and it's Dad. I can tell it's Dad now because he's acting goofy, really goofy, and he dangles this necklace in my face and puts his head on my lap, lays on the stomach in the car and passes out and we drive home.
Okay.
So when we get home, he's already passed out. Craig has to carry him into the house. He never moves when he's on my lap. He passes out almost immediately. And we drive the 30 minutes back home. And so he is carried into the house in this condition. And then my mother calls his father, who then calls the brother. All of this occurs. And by the time they get there, it's 1 p.m.
Okay.
Okay, so here is the wife admitting him in the hospital because Uncle Harold doesn't even remember him getting there. Again, the reason I think the significance of this is he was close to death and they all knew it. And so there's no way that you're on a couch for 6 hours close to death. That's just not how these things happen. But to be carried in because you've been working all day and there's now this emergency, this is why nobody remembers the facts, because it absolutely was indeed an emergency. He was damn near dead.
Right.
And so these are the bedside notes that just again show how sick he is. At 2:40, so they bring him in at 1 o'clock, almost 3 hours later. He's barely responding, but he's still not entirely conscious. At 3 a.m., it says that he's resting better and the family's sent home, which also supports my memory of my mother coming in later that night. The house has been quiet for a long time and she comes in and talks to me. I can't answer her questions, but I remember that it was so late that after she left, I can remember it wasn't too long before the morning came up. And when the morning twilight kind of started, I remember thinking I could go to sleep. At 4 o'clock, the notes say that he's talking, but his tongue is very thick and it's not distinct. So this was a very sick man.
He was gravely ill.
Gravely ill. So ill, as a matter of fact, that it takes them 6 days to stabilize his blood sugar.
Wow.
Now, of course, this was 1968, but anybody who knows diabetic, like we were kids, you'd put sugar in orange juice, stir it up and give it to him and he'd be okay. Later, we had glucose under his tongue. Like,
right.
Incredibly serious. To be 6 days to get his blood sugar under control is outrageous.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about what you learned when you started reading about stress and diabetes.
I didn't really realize that stress affects us all, obviously, in ways, but a diabetic, it's very different. There was never a time in his life again that my father ever was taken to the hospital for 6 days. I can remember times in my adolescence that mom woke me up and would say, Dad won't take his medicine. Would you please go give it to him? And he'd be in a reaction. One time I can remember us calling an ambulance and he went to the hospital to come home the next day. Like, even Uncle Harold, and later in his life, took Dad to the hospital and he came home the next day. Like 6 days, it just doesn't happen. So,
right.
It wreaks havoc on their systems. They're not like we are. Their blood sugar goes out of whack. The hospital records, there's many pages of it. I only showed a few, but the hospital records, I don't really know how to read them, but it's very clear that his blood sugars, it took them 6 days to get his blood sugar to come into order.
Right. And you can see through the records the diligence with which they worked and the amount of time it really took to get those levels under control and to stabilize.
Exactly.
Which is remarkable to read through.
Yeah, it really is. The hospital records are something. And again, it just shows a very ill man. He's 29 years old. You have to remember he was in really good health any other way. And for the rest of his life, he lived until his 70s. So it is just very significant that it was stress lack of eating and drinking all day after he met
Mhm.
this woman. And of course, they're drinking in that room in the morning. So after he kills her, they've
Right.
already been drinking. He'd probably been up drinking with her the night before. And so
And physical exertion if he was,
exactly, they worked all day. That's exactly right.
right. Okay. So you're starting to oh you're starting to learn a lot about all of the details that really helped shape this case. And you now have the hospital records, you have the date. What do you do with the date? And how do you proceed from here?
So everything completely changed. Going back to the day that that woman at the hospital said to me, "I don't know what you need with these, but I hope you find it." Everything just changed. So I take the facts that I have. I have nothing before that because I don't know to look outside of my area. So now I have the date of June 8th, 1968. The cold case cowboys told me that a lot of people don't find who they're looking for because they don't nationally. And so they told me that, I just remember them saying they included this thing that you're like a page of things that you should do. And one of them was enter it into a national database. So my facts find there's only one woman in all of America, and it's case file 428 DFCA, and it's Madeline Babcock. I enter my facts into the database. Only one hit to this day matches that day.
Wow.
2 years later, this woman has still never been found, and she last was heard from on a Saturday in June 1968. She calls her mother and her sister and says, "Hey, I'm going to have a friend bring me there." She never makes it there. And this is the woman that went missing, Madeline Anna Babcock. And you can see them that she's been missing since 6/11, 1968. In our next episode, we'll go over all the facts about this woman, but they're very significant. So my facts indeed found this woman.
Right.
Everything.
Wow. Okay, well, thank you so much for listening, everyone. Please feel free to reach out and contact us if you have any thoughts or ideas or insights, ways to help. Many armchair citizen detectives have helped crack unsolved and cold case murders, so we'd love to hear from you. We'll be back with episode 3 next week, where we will get into the life and the untimely death of Madeline Babcock. And Jodie will describe the process of hiring a PI to investigate her family and how she built a 3-year relationship with Madeline's sister. So please join us next week. We look forward to sitting down with you and chatting again.
Great. Thank you.